This is a brief introduction to discourse analysis. Before starting this, it should be said that there are several types of discourse analysis. This probably covers quite a lot of the ideas behind most of them. There is a debate taking place. There are different schools. I think this should get you to what the idea is that discourse analysis relates to. So firstly, it's an approach to analysing texts. 2 points here. The first thing is that in this sort of social studies, a text is not just a set of words. It can also be a video or audio. And the second point is that the reason why text is used is because of the idea of linguistics that is connected with this idea. So that linguistics, or the interconnection of words, has become quite important in social studies. So it's not just about texts as we normally would understand them, and that the importance of words is highlighted, the importance of language is explicitly highlighted. And in fact, you could probably even say that it's a stronger idea that almost if you take words, they sort of end up controlling us, that language becomes super important. The second point is, with discourse analysis, is that power is expressed through discourse, or what we would normally commonly call discussion. And the third point is that in these conversations, in these discussions, in these connections almost, if you analyze those, you can look at the power relations that are being expressed, or perhaps in discourse analysis, this is power. It's not just the power relations that are being expressed. In some forms of discourse analysis, or depending on how you read it, conversation is power. Texts are power, almost. It's one of the ideas behind this is the idea of language as a self-contained system. People like Saussure, famously Saussure, said that the reference, the way that, for example, a dog in English is dog, in French it is chien, there is no external judge of that a language is a self-contained system with no outside references or reference that could explain why dog was dog and chien was chien. And that sort of idea of a self-contained system almost on its own. This is why in some readings of this you can get the idea that the discussions are the power relations. And discourse analysis is generally linked to an author called Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is one of the major influences of 20th century social thought. Now, I sort of recommend that you read Foucault. There's a really beautiful book that he wrote. Beautiful is the wrong word, but it's called Discipline and Punish. And it reads almost like a novel. It reads like a history book. It's an incredible story of how prisons changed, how punishment changed, how from pre-modern societies to modern societies, we stopped hunting witches. We changed how people were punished. We looked at the idea of rehabilitation. It's a great read, really interesting. And what you should see in this book is it shows how the idea of the body, the idea of the individual changed over time, and this transformed prisons and punishment. And essentially through this, Foucault looks at how power relations were expressed, or what power relations became, and how prisons worked. And Foucault's quite complicated ideas. But in the mainstream reading today, in the contemporary reading today, the idea is that power comes from everywhere. That it's not so much that there's a central set of ideas or a ruling class, for example, but the interplay of conversation. This is power. So power has got multiple focal points, multiple lines of influence, and this is how the idea of language as this all-encompassing set of power, influence of power, comes into being. And one of the things that Foucault looked at in this book, which is just an incredible idea, I think, is the idea of the Panopticon. So pan means overall or everywhere, and opticon is about the eye. And this is a prison. This is a photo, thankfully, of a disused prison. And what happened in this prison was the guards would sit in the middle, and they could see into every single cell. The prisoner was afforded no privacy. They were under constant monitoring, or else constant fear of monitoring. And this is the idea, and the prisoners could see each other as well. So this is the idea of these many eyes, these multiple eyes. And this was done to try to rehabilitate prisoners, to try to change how they behaved. The idea being that if they were under the gaze of someone else all the time, then they would no longer behave in a destructive way, as was seen previously. So as I say, thankfully, this sort of outlook had changed, but it was a product of the idea that you could change the individual in modern times. You could rehabilitate the individual. And this is a good analogy, I think, for the idea of how people understand Foucault's ideas, because it's about this multiple points of power, this idea of power is expressed through many different locuses, such that almost you can't get away from it, and such that the center is not as vital as might be considered. If you think about it today, perhaps you think about the city. You go into the city and you see thousands upon thousands of video cameras, and the idea that people could watch all these video cameras, and that it was very unlikely that you are alone, at least in public. I suppose in public you're not supposed to be alone, but the small ability to be yourself unobserved is limited in the city. So, do you have to be a Foucauldian to use discourse analysis? I don't think you do. I think there are some problems with Foucault, or maybe not so much with Foucault, but with Foucauldians, some people that use Foucault to make particular points. Because I think it's very clear that, as far as I can see anyway, power is not as undifferentiated as the Foucauldians make out. Power is not something that runs through everything in the same way. There are different types of power other than conversation, other than words, other than language. And I think to reduce everything to language, that comes with lots of problems. There are relationships that don't work through conversations or discourse. If you look at someone like a guy called Bourdieu makes the argument that when someone talks, when someone has a conversation, they have an accent, they wear clothes, they're socially situated, they're in positions of power or not. And so to use discourse or conversation in an undifferentiated way is incorrect. In the same way, I suppose that we if Boris Johnson says something, the Prime Minister or the President, if Donald Trump says something, that's very different from someone else saying something. If you have an accent, if you your physical body is different, if you're young or old, these things make a difference to this discourse. And Bordeaux's argument was that the attempt to take language and make it key to understanding things is the idea that all language is just language, but because it's embedded bodily and those bodies are embedded socially, it's reductionism. It's wrong to reduce things to language. So do you have to be a Foucauldian to use discourse analysis? The answer is no. And that, I think, is why, well, my answer is no. That is because it does sensitize us to the idea that in these conversations there are relationships of power. And if you look at those with that viewpoint, that idea that it's not just words, these are expressions of power, rather than being power in itself, then that can bring something out of the text that otherwise you wouldn't see, you wouldn't be thinking about, you wouldn't be focusing on. So what is the method for discourse analysis? This sort of discourse analysis anyway. So maybe previously you've looked at something like content analysis. In content analysis you have a sort of theory in mind, and with that theory in mind you look for things like keywords, you look for patterns of arguments being repeated, and you see whether that fits your theory or maybe invalidates the theory. But with discourse analysis, the initial idea at the very least is to put the theories that you have to the back of your mind, to forget the theories you've got about the thing that you're looking at, to try to go in with an open mind. And it's not that these theories are not important, they are important, but you don't want to prejudge your analysis. You don't want to go in, well, I'm looking for this relationship of power and find it. That's the idea. You don't want to just support the preconditions that you'd already got. So in this way, it's quite an open idea, this form of content analysis. And what you're thinking about, what you're trying to understand, is to see how the conversations interact, how they connect with each other. And this idea is of intertextuality, that the text interact. Now, just as an aside, as a slight aside, there are some ideas that if you think about yourself, for example, if you think about yourself, where do your ideas come from? Well, they come from things that you read. They come from people that you know, right? So where do these people that you know, where do their ideas come from? Well, they come from conversations and things that they read. And if you keep going to the bottom of this pile, this is the idea that you're not an individual, you're an interconnection of texts, you're an interconnection of conversations. You are not an individual, but the focal point of these connections of power. Right? This is the sort of Foucauldian type idea. We don't have to quite buy that. There might be some other factors which are more material or more social that are not in the texts. However, what we're looking for is how the text in this content analysis, how the texts interact. What we interpret from that, we can see some relationships of power without necessarily making the case that everything should be reduced to that intertextuality. So how on earth do you begin this discourse analysis? Well, the sort of idea is you read everything you can, because the texts are not, formally speaking, prioritized before you go to them, because the relationships of conversations are so many and multivaried. You sort of should read everything you can. And as you're doing that, you're looking out for key themes that are repeated. You're looking at the words that are used and the meaning of those words and the connections between groups of ideas. And the big thing is, because you're looking for power, how power relations are expressed, you should particularly be sensitive to the idea of how persuasion is attempted, by how in these discourses, in these discussions, in these texts, there is an attempt to persuade. So is this a bit woolly at this phase? Probably is a little bit woolly. And what you can do is you can go and find different types of content analysis and see which how it works, how these work, because there are so many variations. So overall, trace the conversations, look for relationships of power, bring in concepts and theories that explains these relationships. For example, you might use the idea of moral panics, but start with no theory, look at what conversations are taking place, look at how persuasion's attempted, look at for relationships of power, and then you should see patterns, and then you can try and explain those patterns through concepts and theories. Or maybe there are new concepts and theories in there sometimes. Let's just look at an example. This is a what's it called? A summary of the start of a research document. It's from Paulson and Kale, Limits of National Discourse on a Transnational Phenomenon. And what do they say? They quote someone. Lynn and Lee's discourse analysis of letters to the editor in British national newspapers found that newspapers and their readers are involved in the social construction of asylum seekers, employing the ideas of citizenship, identity, and nationhood within a variety of discursive and rhetorical strategies that contribute to a new apartheid. So they're talking about Lynn and Lee doing a discourse analysis. What did they do a discourse analysis of? They looked at national newspapers and they looked at how what letters people wrote about asylum seekers, and these sort of discussions, and they make the case that this involved the social construction of asylum seekers. In other words, creating the meaning of what they were in society. And to do that, they use ideas of citizenship, are they citizens or not, their identities, their nationhood, and they use different rhetorical or discursive strategies, in other words, different forms of argument, and that these became part of what Lynn and Lee describe as a new apartheid, or a new breaking away of asylum seekers from the rest of society. And they carry on. In general, asylum seekers are constructed as a threat to the stability of society, a challenge to British cultural distinctiveness, and a serious social problem. Letter writers from across the political spectrum made strong distinctions between us and them. So this is examples of words being brought out, these little quotes, and used a range of rhetorical strategies. Rhetorical is like methods of arguing, employed to criticize asylum seekers, whilst at the same time simultaneously attempting to appear reasonable and non-racist. The authors point out that while racism still persists, carries on, it's now considered a social taboo, and thus the rhetoric that accompanies it is altered. They claim that the language of culture and nation can be used to invoke a, quote, hidden racial narrative. So what they're doing is they're describing Lynn and Lee's analysis. Lynn and Lee look at the letters to the editor, look at the ideas that come out with us and them, look at how few times they they make overtly racist arguments, how they attempt to appear reasonable, but through ideas of citizenship. Are you a British citizen or not? Is your identity a British identity? Is your nation Britain? Where do your loyalties lie? They create a division between the population and asylum seekers, such that asylum seekers become defined as a not being culturally distinct from Britain and a serious social problem. And so, looking at this conversation, you can see that they've brought out various features of the discussion. How useful this is, how good this analysis is, perhaps you have to work out. You should try to find examples of discourse analysis in your area or the particular theme that you're looking at, rather than just going to it blind. I think that is the best way for you to sort of identify the extent to which discourse analysis will work for you. You might also further look at the research methods for small studies. I think would be a useful example. Anyway, hope this helped. Thank you very much. Goodbye.